Canadian Pacific 2816. After a decade of being in the back shops of Calgary, this beautiful Hudson makes its grand return to steam across North America. In this video, we follow the Empress as she pulls the final spike tour from St. Paul, Minnesota to Chicagoland in Illinois, across the old Milwaukee Road main line. We see the Hudson along the shores of the mighty Mississippi River and across central and southern Wisconsin. And to finish the video off, in Chicagoland, we see some of Metra's new EMD SD70 MACHs as they pull commuter trains across Metra's Milwaukee District North and West lines. Now, let's follow the Empress as she goes down the old Milwaukee Road. The date is May 5th, 2024. On this day, my dad and I are located at the Maxwell Avenue overpass just north of Newport, Minnesota. We are here to see yet another special steam locomotive, Canadian Pacific 2816. In 2024, to celebrate the first year of the new Canadian Pacific Kansas City Railway, it ran a special steam excursion from its headquarters in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, all the way down to Mexico City in Mexico and return. Along the journey, the train made many stops across central North America. In this video, we'll follow the special as it ran from St. Paul, Minnesota to Chicagoland across the old Milwaukee Road main line. Here, the overpass flies over both the river and St. Croix subdivisions, as well as US Highway 10. The overpass also provides a great view of the Gerdau steel plant. This plant was built in 1964 and was used by Cargill Inc. until 2004, when Gerdau purchased it. This plant stayed active until 2020, when Gerdau idled the facility and operations here were downsized. Down the tracks, we can see a train waiting at the entrance of CPKC's St. Paul yard, waiting to leave it. The first train we saw here was a westbound BNSF freight train on the St. Croix sub. Unfortunately, it came so fast I barely had time to catch it on camera. Sometime after the BNSF freight train passed, we soon started to see whiffs of steam coming from down the line. It was almost time for 2816 to leave St. Paul Yard, but just before the engine took off, Amtrak's eastbound Empire Builder, train number 8, passed by underneath us. Leading the train was Amtrak 388 and 331, two of Amtrak's new Siemens ALC-42 locomotives. After the builder passed, it was now time for 2816 to depart St. Paul, and we got to watch as the engine passed by the steel plant here. Besides CP2816, CP1401, and 4107, two EMD FP9As were also on the train, acting as helpers, looking stunning with their steam counterpart. 1401 was built in 1958, and 4107 a year later, both ironically for CP's rival, the Canadian National Railway, as 6541 and 6526. For 1401, it was then sold to the Nebraska Railway Incorporated, or Nakota Railway for short, where it wore a beautiful red and silver band paint scheme. It worked there until 1998, where it was then sold to its current owner, Canadian Pacific. For 4107, after life on Via Rail, it was then sold to the Ohio Central Railroad, where it wore a Pennsylvania Railroad-inspired Tuscan red and gold stripe paint scheme. It worked there until 2006, when it was then sold to its current owner, Canadian Pacific. After the train took off, we then made our way down to Hastings, Minnesota. Located here is the Hastings Rail Bridge, a vertical lift/through truss deck girder bridge. The bridge was first built in 1910 by the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad, which would later become the famed Milwaukee Road. This bridge was originally built as a swing span, but by 1981, the swing span of the bridge was replaced with this new vertical lift bridge, as the old swing span became obsolete for at the time rail traffic. Just across the river, both CPKC and BNSF take their separate ways down the Mississippi River. While CPKC crosses the river here, BNSF stays on the other side of the river through Wisconsin. Soon after arriving here, we then heard the whistle of 2816 in the distance and quickly got ready for the shot. Besides the power, the train consisted of 2 water tenders, a vintage 40-foot boxcar, and 14 varying styles of passenger cars. The last car on the train for this run was CPKC number 1, Stamford Fleming. An interesting thing about this car was that it was fitted with a diesel-style air horn, which the railway executives took advantage of. We'll get back to the Stamford Fleming's history as well as the rest of the passenger cars later. After seeing the train cross the mighty Mississippi River, we were unable to catch up to the train until it made a maintenance stop just north of Kellogg, Minnesota. From along East Wabasha County Road 30, we could see the train sitting in a siding along the main line. While we're here, let's talk about the history of this beautiful locomotive. Canadian Pacific 2816 is an H1B 464 Hudson type locomotive. It was built in 1930 by the Montreal Locomotive Works in Montreal, Quebec. The engine was one of 10 H1Bs built for the Canadian Pacific Railway. The B in the classification name stood for the second batch of CP Hudsons built, as the first batch were labeled as H1As. When 2816 and its sibling engines came out, Canadian Pacific assigned them to pull their premier passenger trains between Winnipeg, Manitoba, and Fort Williams, Ontario, on the western shore of Lake Superior. In 1937, when the H1Cs and later H1D Royal Hudsons were introduced, 2816 was reassigned to secondary passenger services between Windsor, Ontario, just across the border from Detroit, Michigan, to Quebec City, Quebec. 2816's last assignments during the 1950s were to pull commuter trains out of Montreal, Quebec. Interestingly, in 1957, 2816 received an overhaul and gained the tender from Royal Hudson 2822. But by May 26, 1960, CP finally retired the venerable steam locomotive. That same year, over in the United States, F. Nelson Blount, founder of Steamtown, USA, wanted to expand his collection of steam locomotives. He originally wanted to acquire a New York Central 464 Hudson, but unfortunately by then, all the Hudsons from that railroad had been scrapped. So he began to look up north to Canada, where he found 2816. He purchased the Canadian Hudson and had it moved from the deadline in Angus, Ontario, to Bellows Falls, Vermont in the United States, where he then put the engine on static display at Steamtown. During the winter of 1983 to 1984, 2816, along with the rest of the Steamtown collection, was moved to Scranton, Pennsylvania, and later, when Steamtown, USA became Steamtown National Historic Site, 2816 was deemed as surplus to the collection, and the new Steamtown wanted to get rid of the locomotive. During this time, back in Canada in the mid to late 1990s, Canadian Pacific's then president and CEO, Robert J. Ritchie, had reorganized the company and had started the Royal Canadian Pacific, a scenic excursion train to honor the railway's history. As part of this plan, he wanted to start a steam program for the Canadian Pacific. In 1998, when CP was looking for a steam engine, BC Rail, who also operated their own steam program at the time, informed them that Steamtown was wanting to sell off 2816. So, CP acquired the engine, and after being inspected, it was then moved from Steamtown all the way across Canada to BC Rail's North Vancouver workshops to begin restoration. 2 years later, and $2 million spent, 2816 rolled under her own power on August 16, 2001. It was one of the most expensive restoration projects at the time, but it was well worth it. Between 2001 and 2011, 2816 pulled many excursions on the Canadian Pacific Railway, both across Canada and the United States. In 2011, while pulling an excursion, 2816, now known as the Empress by the railroad, suffered a mechanical problem, which had it go back to Calgary for repairs. In 2012, CP had a corporate changeup, with E. Hunter Harrison becoming the new president and CEO. Harrison wasn't interested in keeping the steam program going, so he ended it, but kept 2816 on the CP roster. It wouldn't be until 2020 when the engine was fired up once again, but just for testing and for a Canadian Pacific holiday train video. Then, in 2021, Canadian Pacific announced their intentions of purchasing and later merging with the Kansas City Southern Railway. As part of the push for the merger, CP's new president and CEO, Keith Creel, announced that if the merger was to go through, that they would restore and run 2816 on their first anniversary of the new company from their HQ in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, all the way down to Mexico City and return. When the merger was approved in 2023, CP was true to its word. By late 2023, CPKC began running some test runs of 2816, which brings us to now. While there are 4 other surviving CP Hudsons left in the world, 2816 is the only H-1B left from the early batches of Canadian Pacific Hudsons, and is the only operational standard gauge Hudson in North America. As I said earlier, the crew of 2816 was doing routine maintenance on the locomotive here. During the journey, the train would make routine stops like this one just to make sure that 2816 was still in good condition, such as this whistle test that I accidentally witnessed right here. Right behind 2816's tender was FSPX 4219 and CPKC 35508, 2 water tenders. FSPX 4219 was built in 1942 as the tender for Southern Pacific 4219, an AC-10 4882 cab forward. When the locomotive 4219 was scrapped, its tender was later used for the Southern Pacific's rotary snowplows and even in firefighter service on the remote parts of the Southern Pacific. In 1984, the tender was purchased by the Friends of the 4449, where it became 4449's water tender. The tender is still owned by the group, but is being leased to CPKC for this special trip. CPKC 35508 was built in 1940 as the tender for Delaware and Hudson 1517, a 4664 Challenger. While the engine itself was scrapped in 1952, the tender managed to survive as part of a maintenance-of-way train, and when CP acquired the Delaware and Hudson, the tender was rebuilt for 2816's first excursion career. Soon it was time for the special train to get back underway, and the crew got back on their engines. As the train left the siding for the main, we'll now pace the train along East Wabasha County Road 30. Also, I must apologize for my poor audio here. As the train gets up to speed, the audio from my mic got blown out by the wind, but I hope you guys enjoy the video still. seeing the train along East Wabasha County Road 30, the next place we saw the train at was along Highway 61 in the small riverside town of Minneaska, Minnesota. Here, after playing a real-life game of Frogger, the tracks run right alongside the Mississippi River, with a high green 2816 blazed through town. After our second game of Frogger, we then moved on to our next game, the Hiawatha 400. After getting first place, our next place we saw the train at was at a railroad access road just east of Winona, Minnesota. Here we saw a moving house fire and then saw 2816 fly by on the causeway. After seeing the train here, we then got some more pacing action along Highway 61. After we got ahead of the train, we then crossed the border into La Crosse, Wisconsin. Here, we drove up to the old Milwaukee Road passenger station and got to watch as 2816 pulled into town. Just like back in Kellogg, La Crosse was another maintenance stop for the locomotive. Not only were the rail fans out in force, but also the residents of La Crosse were also out here as well as the CPKC police to keep the peace. While we're here, let's talk about the passenger cars on today's train. Starting with CP1 Stanford Fleming, it was built in 1949 by the Pullman Standard Company for the New York Central Railroad as their 10333. It was originally a 10-6 sleeping car named Saugus Creek. In 1965, it was then sold to the Canadian National, and in 1978, it was then converted into a track inspection car, or better known as a theater car, due to its theater-like seating and big window at the rear end of the car. It was then sold in the early 2000s to the Canadian Pacific Railway, and now belongs to CPKC. After Stanford, the next car was CP2 Bonfield. From what I could find, CP2 was built in 1921 by the Canadian Car and Foundry for CN as their 1546 New Westminster. Later on, the car was used on Canadian National's Office Car Special as 1058 Gatineau. Also, sorry if I got the French name pronounced wrong. Sometime in the early 2010s, Gatineau was sold to CP and given the name Bonfield. The next car on the train was CP70, a Assiniboine. It was built in 1929 as one of the original CP business cars for the railroad. It stayed that way until the CP-KCS merger of 2023. If the information I got for this car is right, this car is 95 years old as of 2024. The next car on the train was former Kansas City Southern 1970 Baton Rouge. While I couldn't find where this car was built or when this car was built, it was used on KCS's former business train, the Southern Belle, wearing the famous Southern Belle paint scheme. When the merger occurred, CPKC repainted the car into CP's passenger car colors and left the name and former road on the sides. After the former Kansas City Southern car was CP 3605 Selkirk. The Selkirk was first built by the Pullman Standard Company in 1938 for the Southern Pacific Railroad as their tavern car 10312. In 1955, the SP sent that car, along with a few others, to the Sacramento shops where it was rebuilt into a dome lounge car. The car gained the nickname the 3/4 dome car, due to the glass dome only stretching 3/4 of the way across the car. This was only an SP thing, and the car ran on the Southern Pacific's premier passenger trains such as the Shasta Daylight, the San Juan Daylight, and the Overland route. In 1972, the car was then sold to Amtrak, where it continued to operate for them until it was retired from passenger service in 1981. From there, the car bounced around North America from owner to owner until 2000, when the car ended up on the Royal Gorge Route Railroad. There it sat until 2018, when Canadian Pacific Railway acquired the car, and after an extensive rebuild in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, the car began running for the Canadian Pacific's Office Car Special in 2019. CP-103 Major Rogers was originally built for the Union Pacific Railroad as their 5503. It worked for them on many of their famed city trains until it was sold to Amtrak. There, it still worked for them, pulling many passenger trains across their system. Eventually, it ended up on CP's roster in 2009. After the 103 was CP89, Glacier. Unfortunately, other than finding the number, I was unable to find any other information on this coach. CP73, Mount Royal, was built by the Canadian Pacific in 1927. It was originally built with a more traditional, heavyweight style roof, but sometime between 2015 and 2016, it was rebuilt with a new roof. The next former KCS car on the train was 1810 San Luis Potosi. This car was originally Illinois Central 3500 Baton Rouge. Once on the KCS, it was then given its current name and number, but just like KCS's Baton Rouge, when the CPKC merger happened, this car was also given the same treatment. CP110, the HB Bowen, was originally built by the Canadian National as their 1137 Enfield. It ended up on Via Rail and later BC Rail until it was sold to the Canadian Pacific. The last former KCS car on this train was 2007 Veracruz. This car had an interesting history as well. It was originally built for the Florida East Coast Railway as their Argentina. It was then sold to the Canadian National Railways as their 2131 Grand Codroy River. After the CN, it then worked for Via Rail and another company, and then Rail Cruise America as their 800515 Colorado River. Then sometime in 2006, it was then sold to the Kansas City Southern, and I believe you guys can guess where the rest of the history went on this one. The next car on the train was CP97. 97 is a former baggage car, now generator car, on the train. Unfortunately, again, this was all the information I was able to find on this car. CP111 Vaughn was originally built as a U.S. Army car 89520. It was originally a U.S. hospital car. Eventually, it later worked for Amtrak and then worked for Railroad Heritage of the Midwest America. It was given a Milwaukee Road style paint scheme and given the name Grand Canyon and the number 1615. The car was only recently acquired by CPKC in 2023. The last passenger car on this train was CP99. This car was built in 1954 as Union Pacific 5655. It stayed on the Union Pacific Railroad, later being used in MOW service until 2004 when it was sold to the Canadian Pacific. While 99 was the last passenger car on the train, there was one more car on this train, CP29114. This 40-foot boxcar was built in 1937 for the Canadian Pacific. As of today, it is currently 2816's tool car and used on long-distance trips such as the Final Spike Tour. If I got any of the information on these cars wrong, or you guys have some more information on some of the cars I wasn't able to get information for, please leave a comment down below. As a final note, when we left St. Paul, 2816 was traveling on CPKC's River Subdivision. We'll now be entering onto CPKC's Tolma Subdivision for the rest of the journey to Portage. While the crew of 2816 continued their maintenance on the locomotive, we decided to get out of town. The next place we saw the train at was at the South Water Street Railroad crossing in Sparta, Wisconsin. Following alongside the old Milwaukee Road main line was the La Crosse River State Trail / Sparta La Crosse Bike Trail, which started back in La Crosse. Both this trail and the Elroy Sparta Trail, which starts on the other side of Water Street, is the abandoned right-of-way of the old Chicago and Northwestern line that ran from La Crosse to Elroy, Wisconsin. The old 1915-built Northwestern station still stands along the old right-of-way. Soon we heard in the distance 2816 approaching, so we got ready to see it. After this stop, the next place we saw the train at was near the intersection of Highway 12/Road 16 and N Road, just west of Oakdale, Wisconsin. After seeing the train here, we then got some more pacing action of 2816 along Highway 12 between Oakdale and New Lisbon, Wisconsin. As we drew ahead of the train, the next place we saw it was along Blast Street in Mouston, Wisconsin. The next place we saw 2816 at was on the Road 23/13 Broadway Bridge in the tourist town of Wisconsin Dells, Wisconsin. Here, the old Milwaukee Road line crosses over the Wisconsin River on the Wisconsin Dells Railroad Bridge. This bridge was built in 1903 by the Phoenix Bridge Company of Phoenixville, Pennsylvania, for the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad, to replace an older bridge. The bridge, from end to end, is 470 feet long and is estimated to be around 45 feet above the waterline. This bridge proved to be a popular spot for many people trying to see the train. Unfortunately for many of us, including me, 2816 snuck up on us, and I barely caught it as it came across the bridge. The last place we saw the train at was at the Brook Road Railroad crossing just west of Portage, Wisconsin. Just like many other places along the line, many people were out in force by the tracks waiting for the special train. Here, a second track splits off the main line to enter into the small yard located in downtown. Also located here is Cardinal F.G. Portage, a glass manufacturing facility. Soon enough, we watched as 2816 took the lead track for the yard as it slowly rolled by us all. As the train was pulling into the yard, we then drove over to the Amtrak station to try and see 2816 one more time. When we got to the station, we found this ballast train sitting in the yard. This train had many unique cars on it, such as this ballast unloader, and many different types of hopper cars on the train, ranging from moderately new to ones still labeled for their predecessor railroads. After visiting the station, we then drove to the other side of the yard, along Effenbeck Street, where we found the train. When we got there, the crew of the train were in the process of doing general maintenance on both 2816 and the rest of the train itself, getting it ready for the next day's run to Chicago. With nothing left to do, my dad and I then drove over to the hotel to spend the night. The next day, we returned to the yard thinking we were ready for the next leg for Chicagoland. Starting from here, the train will make its way down the Watertown subdivision to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Once there, the train will then turn south for Chicagoland on CPKC's Chicago and Milwaukee subdivision, also known as the C&M sub. As everyone was gathering to see the magnificent engine take off, the crew were making their final checks and balances before pulling out. Before most people knew what was happening, 2816 gave a blast of the whistle and the engine took off with the train. After watching the train depart, we then got on the road. With the help of some locals in the area, the next place we got set up was at the Road P railroad crossing southeast of Portage. This area is called Portage East by CPKC and is where the yard in town ends and rejoins the main line. After getting set up, we soon heard the chuffing of the Empress and started rolling. Once the train was out on the main line, 2816 was given permission to do track speed for the rest of the run till their next stop. And with the track speed for passenger trains on this subdivision being at 79 miles per hour, the engineer took full advantage of this. While 2816 and the locals and rail fans with scanners were having a great time, we were... Needless to say, we had some catching up to do. Eventually, we caught up with 2816 at its next maintenance stop in the town of Neshota, Wisconsin. Knowing what we were chasing now, we decided to get a head start. The next place we got set up was on a dock on Pewaukee Lake in the village of Pewaukee, Wisconsin. Here, the old Milwaukee Road main line runs right along the shore of the lake, making for an excellent shot. Unfortunately, many other people thought the exact same thing and gathered here as well. The whole dock was filled with people, and it felt like the dock could roll over at any moment. Soon enough, we heard the whistle of 2816 in the distance, and we all got quiet to watch as the train rolled along the lake shore. After seeing the train along Pewaukee Lake, the next place we got set up was on North Plankinton Avenue, railroad crossing in downtown Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Here, the Watertown sub passes underneath Milwaukee's USPS Postal Distribution Center. On the other side of this building was Milwaukee's Intermodal Station. Contrary to what the name suggests, the Intermodal Station is Milwaukee's passenger station, serving 3 Amtrak trains as well as light rail and bus services in the city. Once the train made it around the curve, it then entered onto the C&M sub. The last place we unknowingly caught the train at was at the Brunn Road railroad crossing, just southwest of the small community of Sturtevant, Wisconsin. The next place we got set up at was at the Glen of North Glenview Metra Station in Glenview, Illinois. This beautiful station was opened in 2001 and serves as a stop on Metra's Milwaukee District North Line. The station also sees Amtrak trains as well as CPKC freight trains, but the Amtrak trains do not stop here. They instead stop at the nearby main Glenview station in town south of here. When we got here,
just missed the Hiawatha service. Oh well, there'll be more.
After the Hiawatha service passed, we then saw the headlight of 2816 in the distance. We then heard the announcement of an arriving northbound Metra train, and we got set up to watch it pull in. Leading the train was Metra 512, one of the rebuilt EMD SD70 MACHs. .512 was built in 1999, originally as an EMD SD70 Mac for TFM as their 1636. The SD70 MACHs are Metra's newest to them locomotives. Many of the rebuilt SD70 MACHs are ex-KCS or TFM locomotives, rebuilt by Progress Rail. A little bit after the northbound train left, we then heard the announcement of a southbound train coming in. Pushing the Metra train was Metra 516. At the time of our visit, the SD70 MACHs were focused on Metra's Milwaukee District lines. After the southbound Metra train left, we then heard the announcement of a southbound Hiawatha train approaching. This train was being led by Amtrak 90201 and a charger locomotive on the rear. Unfortunately, the train was moving so fast that it made it impossible to see the number of the charger locomotive. After the Hiawatha train passed, we then got word that 2816 left the C&M sub at the junction just north of us and used Union Pacific's Milwaukee subdivision to get to CPKC's Bensonville Yard, just west of Franklin Park. Just before we left the station, we then saw one more Metra train pull in, led by Metra 513. By this point, the chase was pretty much over, but still, we made our way over to the North York Road Railroad crossing in Bensonville just to see what was going on. We got parked along Railroad Avenue, which provided a great view of Tower B-17. We first saw a westbound Metra train being led by Metra 511 on the Elgin subdivision. After the Metra train left, we then saw a westbound grain train as it left the Elgin sub and entered onto the Northwest Bridge sub, which gets to Union Pacific's Milwaukee subdivision. This train was being led by Norfolk Southern 9912 and 9977, two GE C-44CWs, both built in 2004. As the grain train was rolling by, we then saw an eastbound Metra train leaving the Bensonville Metra station, being pushed by Metra 84, an EMD F59 PHI, still wearing its old Amtrak Pacific Surfliner scheme. Once the grain train passed by, we then made our way along Green Street. This is where CPKC's executive train was parked in the Bensonville Yards auto facility. This is where the train will stay for the next couple of days, as 2816 was scheduled to be on display at the Franklin Park station just east of the yard here. While the train will continue down to Mexico, this is where we'll leave 2816. While this day's chase wasn't as successful as the first day, we still had a great time seeing the Empress running down the main line. Also, despite the events that happened in Mexico, hopefully CPKC will continue to run 2816 on its excursions in the future. Well guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. We had a lot of fun chasing the Empress, and hopefully in the future we'll get to see her again. Alright, see you later.
Milwaukee Road